Dusk pinned itself to the ridge like a damp cloth, 1944. Cicadas rasped. Heat lifted off the black rock in slow, invisible breaths. Corporal Danny Ruiz slid a bootlace through the M1's forward sling swivel, looped it around his forearm, and cinched until bone met wood. The rifle stopped floating. His heartbeat, once a bass drum, became a clock. 15 yards below, kunai grass folded, not from wind but from something that knew how to move without it. Ruiz read the sign, the angle, the pause, the second rustle off to the right that meant a spotter. He drew air, held it at half, let the lace take the tremor his pulse could not. 617, Gunny Pike whispered, counting minutes to first light. Ruiz's front sight touched a seam in the grass. The world narrowed to a notch and a post. One breath, one press. Somewhere in the green, a shape decided not to stand up, and with that, this little war found its hinge. The map called it Hachinawa, but no Marine used the name. To them, it was simply the Black Island, a half square of volcanic rock shaped like a broken tooth, stuck between the Philippines and an empty patch of Pacific that smelled of rot and salt. It was late October 1944. The big battles were elsewhere, Leyte, Peleliu, Formosa. But the little ones, the kind that erased patrols without headlines, still lived here. The 5th Marines had been pushing inland for 12 days. The first 3 were easy: coastline, coral flats, abandoned shacks. Then the land rose into jagged ridges where no tank could crawl and no map could be trusted. Rain turned soil into glass. Every step up the slope rasped like a warning. By the time Baker Company reached the northern saddle, 2 platoons had been cut down to 1 and the word patrol had come to mean gamble. Enemy contact never came in volleys. It came in whispers. At dawn, a single rifle crack from somewhere above the mist. At dusk, a mortar shell walking back and forth across a trail. And always the same pattern afterward. Bodies hit, radios silent, footprints gone. Japanese scouts worked in pairs. Ghosts in fatigues dyed brown with tree sap. They slid between rocks with a grace that mocked gravity, marking firing lines with chalk dots no one saw until too late. Their orders were not to hold ground, but to make Marines bleed for trying. They never lingered. A squad could sweep the gully 10 minutes after a hit and find nothing but shell casings pressed into mud like fossils. Baker Company's commander, Captain Rawls, called it fighting a rumor, but rumors kill too. By the end of the first week, morale had thinned like blood in rainwater. That's when Gunny Walt Pike pulled his platoon together under a torn poncho in the dark and said what every man was thinking. We need to see them before they see us. We're not losing another kid to a ghost. Pike was 40, built like a filing cabinet, voice gravel from Guadalcanal. He'd outlived too many of his own sergeants by being methodical to the point of superstition. His solution was simple. Slow everything down until the island had no patience left to hide things. He reorganized his men into tight stalking pairs, 1 shooter, 1 eye. They moved like clock gears instead of a train, each step placed where another had already survived. Corporal Danny Ruiz was his left-hand gear. 24 from El Paso, a former machinist who believed the world could be fixed if you understood its tolerances. He treated his M1 like a precision instrument, filed burrs from the trigger guard, oiled the bolt with cloth so thin it looked stolen from church linen. What he couldn't fix was the tremor that rode his pulse after hours in the jungle heat. That's where the bootlace came in. It started as a joke. Ruiz tying his rifle to his arm to steady it during a range shoot on Bougainville months earlier. The idea worked. Muscle tension replaced heartbeat. Now it was gospel. Every man who'd seen him shoot began copying it, threading laces through sling swivels, building quiet confidence 1 knot at a time. Pike didn't stop them. If it steadies your hand, it steadies your head, he said. And that's what wins. By late October, 1st Platoon had become the regiment's unofficial counter-recon team. They moved when others stopped, hunted when others hid, and their reports began carving clarity into the fog of rumor. Still, on that ridge above the sea, the jungle owned the night. The scouts were out there listening, watching, painting maps of kill zones invisible to the untrained eye. Every breath felt borrowed, and somewhere beneath that constant hum of insects and nerves, Danny Ruiz waited to make the island blink first. The island taught anatomy with rocks and shadows. Ridges rose like knuckles, black basalt punched up through soil that never forgave a misstep. Kunai grass hid gullies deep enough to swallow a man's shout. Pandanus roots webbed the ground slick with rain, mean with thorns. Sound traveled crooked. Whispers carried, boots didn't. A canteen tap could jump 100 yards. A snapped twig died at your knee. Wind came in off the sea, stalled against the ridgeline, and hung there, a damp curtain that kept the day hot and the night close. The Japanese scouts moved inside that physics as if they'd written it. Pairs always. One glass quiet spotter with field glasses wrapped in white cloth to kill glare. One rifle, a Type 99 softened with charcoal and oil. Bamboo camo capes broke their outline in the grass. Mud masks dulled cheek shine. They cached chalked range cards in knotholes and under stones, thin rectangles with grease pencil notes. Gully 180 wideys, tree fork 230, trail bend 90, pre-sight mortar here. They didn't block trails. They read them, laid invisible tripwires of attention across each bend, then cued a mortar team tucked in some reverse slope where the ground swallowed the blast. Marine doctrine had plenty of pages. None were written for a knife fight at 10 yards against a rumor with good ears. So Baker Company borrowed from hunters and machinists. Pike slowed patrol cadence until impatience felt like treason. He cut routes into bounds, eye up high, gun low, then trade. He drafted noise fishing, a tossed coral pebble, a short whistle in cicada rhythm, to snag the attention of a hidden watcher and make his eyes move. If eyes moved, leaf edges moved. If leaf edges moved, Ruiz saw it. Shot discipline became ritual. No 3-round encouragements. One shot, only when the sight picture read like a solved problem. If you missed, you didn't correct. You disappeared and made them guess again. The kit changed too. Helmets wore strips of burlap. Faces wore ash. Leather slings stayed, but marksmen added something cheaper and smarter. The bootlace. Ruiz taught it in whispers. Loop the lace through the forward swivel. Wrap it around the support forearm once or twice. Cinch until bone sits in the stock. Then angle the elbow down to lock shoulder. Sling and breath into one hinge. The rifle stops being a weight. It becomes a lever with your pulse as the fulcrum. On the exhale's natural pause, press, not yank. Press until the trigger surprises both of you. With the M1, it meant calling shots under a heart you could feel. With a borrowed M1903, it meant printing a line on a leaf stem at 120 yards like a pen signing a name. The lace blackened with sweat and salt, went stiff, got better. Men cut spare laces from dead boots and carried them in helmet bands like talismans that actually did something. Doc Tanaka added a layer no field manual covered. Nisei Navy corpsman, Los Angeles-born, Japanese-speaking. He read the captured range cards, scribbled over them in English, mapped the way the enemy thought about distance and habit. They're not daring, he told Pike one night. They're disciplined. They pre-sight places we must pass. So we change what must is. He taught the platoon to avoid the most obvious rocks, to step into the dark soil beside the bright coral, to cross trails where the map said no one would, precisely because the enemy believed that too. The stakes for the next patrol were simple and ugly. A wire section needed to drag comms up to a spur for the company CP. Ammo mules had to reach the saddle without being bracketed. At gray light, Baker would phase through a slot of terrain where 2 fingers of rock created a sniper's theater. 200-yard shot lanes downslope. Dry gully escape routes upslope, 100 places to be dead wrong. Captain Rawls had orders. Push the line to the rim. Hold for battalions jump off at 0900. He gave Pike a smaller, almost private order in the dark. Get me that trail. Don't feed it, boys. Pike nodded once and found Ruiz by feel under the ponchos. You and Rizzo overwatch. You own the first 100 yards. I own everything that follows. Ruiz just checked his lace knot and said nothing. That was consent enough. The night before, rain came thin and mean, the kind that hides more than it washes. The ridge breathed steam. Somewhere to the east, a mortar coughed twice, testing its throat. Ruiz lay on his side, cheek on stock, counting the seconds between swells and wind lulls, turning weather into timing into a plan that would fit inside one breath. At dawn, the island would try to erase them the way it had erased others, but this patrol would arrive with a different grammar, gear in pairs, steps in thirds, a lace cinched until pulse learned manners. The angles of that grammar, human, tactical, technical, decide who writes the next sentence. Danny Ruiz had a ritual that smelled like oil and tobacco. Before patrols, he wiped the M1's stock with the corner of his sleeve until the wood went satin. He checked the sling swivel twice. He ran a thumb along the rear side aperture as if reading Braille. He thought of his sister's metronome at home, their mother's old clock that kept the rhythm of a house, and he tried to make his heart fall into that same steady click. The lace was an extension of that habit, small, private, a thing you could tie when you were about to do something that would otherwise make you smell like fear. Gunny Walt Pike held a different set of rituals. Discipline came to him like a muscle. He corrected posture more often than he shouted. He let a man's mistake stay unpunished if he'd learned from it. Men trusted the quiet of his voice more than the boom of a shout. That trust was currency out here. When he asked Ruiz to hold the first overwatch, his tone wasn't an order so much as a handing over of responsibility. You keep this square, and we all get home another turn. Doc Tanaka carried 2 jobs. He stitched up shrapnel and he read the enemy like an open page. Fluent in Kansai dialect and American bluntness, he translated captured notes in the cadence of mortar crews. He taught the men which kinds of wounds needed immediate morphine and which could be bundled until the medevac arrived. Practical theology in a place that offered little absolution. More than medicine, Tanaka gave the patrol a cultural key. How the scouts thought about silence, which gestures meant scouting, and which meant surrender, which small signs to watch for in a boot print. The patrol moved like a living instrument. Pike split the route into measured legs: approach, hold, sweep, pass. Each leg had a leader and an overwatch. The overwatch pair, 2 men back to back, one watching near, one far, rehearsed a silent choreography. Index finger on trigger, elbow tucked, eyes scanning a wedge that shared the same arcs as the man on point. If the man on point threw noise, 2 pebbles, a clipped whistle, it was not to bait but to measure. Did any grass answer? Did leaves tell on their neighbor? If a response came, the pair folded inward like a hand closing on a coin, and the patrol rewrote its route. Counter-mortar posture was geometry. Scouts cued mortars from predicted sight lines. Countering that required denying predictability. Pike varied approaches, sometimes moving uphill where the enemy expected downhill, sometimes hugging the coral where footprints made less sense. The team used noise fishing in strict increments. 1 pebble, measure 30 seconds, 2 pebbles, measure. A sequence designed to draw eyes without giving away the whole body. Radio discipline was absolute. A single squealed transmission could put a mortar on the line. If a call went up, it was clipped, code, and only after the wound was bandaged or the target neutralized. Rituals framed safety. Before any halt, pairs checked sectors, then performed a 3-count hush. Breath in, settle, exhale, so the shooter could time an exhale-based press with minimal micro-motion. If the patrol halted to feed or move a pack mule, the man on overwatch moved 2 paces downslope to change the sound profile. Simple small acts rewired what silent observers expected. The bootlace sling is nothing mystical. It is geometry made of cord. Threading a bootlace through the forward sling swivel and wrapping it once or twice around the support forearm creates a short mechanical linkage. As the shooter exhales and the chest softens, the tension in the lace counteracts that tiny forward dip of the shoulder and transmits the movement into the stock instead of the sight. Bone on wood becomes a predictable fulcrum. Muscle tremor is reduced to a low-frequency hum. The M1 semi-automatic impulse plays well to the technique because the recoil impulse is split across the shoulder and the lace, whereas the bolt-action M1903 required a slightly different hand angle the butt into the pocket of the shoulder blade and let the lace stabilize. Wrist torque so the follow-through kept the sight picture steady. Practical. Field tweaks augmented the trick. Men wrapped leather strips under their forearm to keep the lace from biting into skin. They slotted small rubber grommets at the swivel to reduce chafe and to make tension repeatable. They photographed, crudely with a pocket camera, sight pictures of common landmarks so a rookie could match what good looked like. A knot in a pandanus root at 120 yards, a split in a boulder that framed a waist-high tuft. Ammunition choice mattered. In humid heat, tracer rounds could fog a sight. Ruiz favored ball loads for clarity and used tracers only when he wanted to mark a fall for mortar correction. The lace stiffened with salt and sweat until it wasn't a cord, but a coiled memory. It frayed, sure, knots loosened, but taught men a muscle memory they could carry when uniforms changed. Breath, hinge, press. The island doesn't forgive mechanics left to chance. Those small mechanics turned into rituals and tactics that would meet the enemy on the island's terms. Danny Ruiz had a ritual that smelled like oil and tobacco. Before patrols, he wiped the M1's stock with the corner of his sleeve until the wood went satin. He checked the sling swivel twice. He ran a thumb along the rear sight aperture as if reading Braille. He thought of his sister's metronome at home, their mother's old clock that kept the rhythm of a house, and he tried to make his heart fall into that same steady click. The lace was an extension of that habit, small, private, a thing you could tie when you were about to do something that would otherwise make you smell like fear. Gunny Walt Pike held a different set of rituals. Discipline came to him like a muscle. He corrected posture more often than he shouted. He let a man's mistake stay unpunished if he'd learned from it. Men trusted the quiet of his voice more than the boom of a shout. That trust was currency out here. When he asked Ruiz to hold the first overwatch, his tone wasn't an order so much as a handing over of responsibility. You keep this square, and we all get home another turn. Doc Tanaka carried 2 jobs. He stitched up shrapnel and he read the enemy like an open page. Fluent in Kansai dialect and American bluntness, he translated captured notes in the cadence of mortar crews. He taught the men which kinds of wounds needed immediate morphine and which could be bundled until the medevac arrived. Practical theology in a place that offered little absolution. More than medicine, Tanaka gave the patrol a cultural key. How the scouts thought about silence, which gestures meant scouting, and which meant surrender, which small signs to watch for in a boot print. The patrol moved like a living instrument. Pike split the route into measured legs: approach, hold, sweep, pass. Each leg had a leader and an overwatch. The overwatch pair, 2 men back to back, one watching near, one far, rehearsed a silent choreography. Index finger on trigger, elbow tucked, eyes scanning a wedge that shared the same arcs as the man on point. If the man on point threw noise, 2 pebbles, a clipped whistle, it was not to bait but to measure. Did any grass answer? Did leaves tell on their neighbor? If a response came, the pair folded inward like a hand closing on a coin and the patrol rewrote its route. Counter-mortar posture was geometry. Scouts cued mortars from predicted sight lines, countering that required denying predictability. Pike varied approaches, sometimes moving uphill where the enemy expected downhill, sometimes hugging the coral where footprints made less sense. The team used noise fishing in strict increments. 1 pebble, measure 30 seconds, 2 pebbles, measure. A sequence designed to draw eyes without giving away the whole body. Radio discipline was absolute. A single squealed transmission could put a mortar on the line. If a call went up, it was clipped code, and only after the wound was bandaged or the target neutralized. Rituals framed safety. Before any halt, pairs checked sectors, then performed a 3-count hush, breath in, settle, exhale, so the shooter could time an exhale-based press with minimal micro-motion. If the patrol halted to feed or move a pack mule, the man on overwatch moved 2 paces down slope to change the sound profile. Simple small acts rewired what silent observers expected. The bootlace sling is nothing mystical. It is geometry made of cord. Threading a bootlace through the forward sling swivel and wrapping it once or twice around the support forearm creates a short mechanical linkage. As the shooter exhales and the chest softens, the tension in the lace counteracts that tiny forward dip of the shoulder and transmits the movement into the stock instead of the sight. Bone on wood becomes a predictable fulcrum. Muscle tremor is reduced to a low-frequency hum. The M1 semi-automatic impulse plays well to the technique because the recoil impulse is split across the shoulder and the lace, whereas the bolt-action M1903 required a slightly different hand angle the butt into the pocket of the shoulder blade and let the lace stabilize. Wrist torque so the follow-through kept the sight picture steady. Practical. Field tweaks augmented the trick. Men wrapped leather strips under their forearm to keep the lace from biting into skin. They slotted small rubber grommets at the swivel to reduce chafe and to make tension repeatable. They photographed, crudely with a pocket camera, sight pictures of common landmarks so a rookie could match what good looked like. A knot in a pandanus root at 120 yards. A split in a boulder that framed a waist-high tuft. Ammunition choice mattered. In humid heat, tracer rounds could fog a sight. Ruiz favored ball loads for clarity and used tracers only when he wanted to mark a fall for mortar correction. The lace stiffened with salt and sweat until it wasn't a cord but a coiled memory. It frayed, sure, knots loosened, but taught men a muscle memory they could carry when uniforms changed. Breath, hinge, press. The island doesn't forgive mechanics left to chance. Those small mechanics turned into rituals and tactics that would meet the enemy on the island's terms. Gunny Pike led like a good tool, reliable, simple, precise. He rationed words the way he rationed water. A palm edge meant down. 2 fingers, eyes right. A flat hand pressed twice, breathe. He believed posture was a weapon. Men moved quieter when their spines remembered orders before brains did. He corrected without humiliation, tapped a helmet, nudged a muzzle, reseated a sling stud with his thumbnail and a grunt that meant there, that's better. Authority became a low temperature around him. It cooled fear enough to let thinking happen. Before every push he made a small theater of care. He checked every pair's lace knot himself, tugging once to feel tension. He asked for wind calls. Sea on the left, ash on the right, what's it tell you? If a man guessed, Pike waited him out until he knew. At halts he walked the line, listening to breath, counting the seconds between swells. He paired hotheads with metronomes, rookies with stubborn men who loved small rules. He had one sentence he saved for the last 10 minutes before gray light. We don't win big today. We win small and we keep winning small until the day is ours. It made ambition manageable. It made survival a craft. The scouts were built from the island. They dressed in angles the sun could not find. Bamboo capes broke shoulders. Mud flattened cheekbones. They drank in a discipline that denied thirst the right to speak. Patrols found footprints that ended under a fern and did not resume. They found twigs bent as if by accident that pointed at trails like arrows written in a dialect only the patient can read. Their doctrine was arithmetic. 2 men mark, a 3rd shoots, a 4th calls the mortar. They didn't waste bullets. 1 rifle crack cued 3 shells. Then silence, thick and total. They used water like currency, sound like weapon, timing like script. They learned Marine habits fast. Which hour produced the sloppy step? Which man always scratched his neck at the same bend? Which radio op fought his handset when the antenna snagged? They wrote that knowledge into grease pencil cards wrapped in oilskin and stashed them where rain could not smudge them. Under rock lips. Inside bamboo joints, in the hollow of a palm where resin sealed like varnish. Doc Tanaka respected them the way a locksmith respects a rival's clean work. He read their notes aloud in the dark. Range ticks, abbreviations, the small pride in neat numerals. They're not zealots here, he told Pike softly. They're craftsmen. They'll do it the same way tomorrow unless we make tomorrow different. The enemy's strength, discipline, was also the hinge that could swing the other way, change the pattern, and you made them clumsy for a breath long enough to matter. There is an intimacy to counter recon that other fights don't have. You kill a man whose breath you can almost count. You solve him like a problem and then carry the solution in your stomach the rest of the day. Ruiz knew this and did the grim math anyway. He didn't hate. Hate shakes the barrel. He made his world small, sight, lace, exhale, and left judgment to chaplains and calendars. Pike's rules were moral as well as mechanical. No victory yells. No trophy cutting. No extra rounds to be sure. You moved in, checked, recorded, and you did it quiet because quiet is respect in a place built from listening. He made it clear to the boys with bright anger that mercy out here wasn't softness. Mercy was leaving no sound for the next patrol to trip over. When a scout fell and the spotter broke, Doc moved in like a liturgy. Pressure, bandage, morphine if the breath had gone shallow enough to justify it. Prisoners, when they happened, were guarded by men Pike trusted to keep their rifles pointed at the ground until pointing them higher was required. There were lines the platoon refused to cross even when the island dared them. No baiting with wounded voices. No false surrender calls. No firing into thickets for comfort. The enemy's mortar teams would gladly use fear to right the day. Pike wouldn't. We're not here to become the island, he said once so quietly that only Ruiz and Tanaka heard him. We're here to pass through it and leave it behind. The lace itself carried a moral weight, the humility of admitting hands shake and then tying something to help them do the right thing anyway. Men joked about it, called it a superstition. But when night crawled close, they reached for cord, found the loop, and turned frailty into function. That act, accepting tremor and correcting it, was the soul of their war. By the time the platoon edged into the gray before dawn, leadership had given them a low flame of calm. The enemy had taught them what not to repeat, and the small ethics had kept their hands from becoming strangers to them. The trail ahead bent out of sight. A mortar tube waited for a signal that would not come if 2 shots did their work. The hinge would be a minute long, maybe less, and every inch of it would ride on breath and cord. Gray light rinsed the ridge until edges returned. The sea on the left murmured like someone thinking. At 0609, Baker's point pair ghosted past the Pandana stand that every range card would favor. Pike raised 2 fingers. Hold. And the whole patrol settled by memory into the island's ribs. Ruiz and PFC Rizzo crawled to a slit of ground where Kunai gave them a keyhole downslope. The slot framed a kink in the trail, exactly the bend a mortar team would pre-sight. Ruiz lay on his left side, heel dug into rock, forearm already braided to the M1 by the salt-stiff lace. He looped once more, set the sling angle until bone kissed stock, then let his cheekbone find its home on the comb. The rifle's float became a level bubble. He checked wind with termite ash pinched between fingers, falling straight, no left drift. A single cough of a distant tube, not fired but lowered, metal touching dirt. Not close, not far enough. Rizzo, watching farther out through a flat of broken leaves, whispered, "Right of the kink, low." Ruiz watched where leaves didn't move and saw the place where they should have. A dead patch in living grass, a shadow wrong by 2 degrees. A strip of cloth where the sun had yet to find it. He eased the front sight into the seam. His heart still pounded, but the lace ate the tremor and traded it for a slow, predictable sway. Pike's voice found them along the scrub via a hand squeeze relay. 1 squeeze ready, 2 count starts. Then the whisper on the radio net, 617. That was the plan. Break the chain before the tube could walk shells onto the bend. Tanaka, 10 yards back, waited with a tourniquet laid open on his thigh and a Japanese code slate in his pocket in case a satchel fell into their hands. A white moth settled on Ruiz's sight hood and changed his sky by a thumb width. He did not twitch. He let it be a cloud. The world corrected around the insect, which meant his hands were working and not his nerves. The notch, the post, the seam. Breath in, hold at half. The island clicked into a frame like a photograph finding focus in a tray. To the right, Rizzo shifted a knuckle's worth. Left of the rock, he breathed. There's your glass. Ruiz searched for the giveaway he'd seen in Bougainville, a spotter's fold of grass not moving with the rest. There, a leaf edge that didn't breathe. He found it and rode the small exhale that came after it. The first mortar round left some hillside beyond, a distant thunk that Marines feel in the collarbones. Bracketing would start with a long, then a short, then a center. If they were on a pre-sight, the short would be right on the bend where Pike's point pair would be in 30 seconds if the plan failed. Wait the long, Pike mouthed more than said. Ruiz did not need the instruction, but it slid into him like another knot. The long landed past the kink and through coral dust like snow. Everyone on the line held the same thought, now or never. Ruiz let the lace carry his pulse down to a thin wire. The front sight touched the wrong shadow. He forgot his name, which is how you know you're ready. The M1 bucked like a courtesy. The moth left his hood in a tiny flurry of nothing. Below, a figure's head snapped back from the seam and went boneless. A second shape jerked toward the gully, spotter choosing flight over fight. Rizzo cut his lane 2 inches to the right and pressed once. The second body folded to a knee, then down, then still. The island waited to see if the men would announce themselves. They did not. The echo died with nothing to hold. Ruiz worked the trigger again, no rush, no victory, and held on target, letting the lace teach his shoulder the second shot's patience. Nothing else moved. The grass believed in wind again. Trail is open, stand by. Pike breathed, then thumbed his handset. Rawls, this is Baker 1, 2 scouts down. No mortar walk, anchor at the kink secured. To the left, far and behind a curve of rock, the mortar coughed again, habit finishing a sequence a dead man had started. The shell buried itself yards off the trail into a nowhere that hurt only air. Pike let it finish bracketing empty ground, then raised his hand and rotated 2 fingers, a wheel turning. Push the wire team. Tanaka slid downslope low, a shadow with hands. He reached the first body with the same courtesy he gave the living. The man wore a bamboo cape pinned with a wire hook. Tan rolled him with respect, eyes on fingers, weapon, breath. He found a grease pencil card in the man's breast pocket, laminated with oil and wrapped in rice paper. He passed it back upslope to Pike without ceremony. Ruiz kept his sight where the world could betray itself and saw only grass, rock, sky. Document later, Pike said. We're not a museum. He glanced at the card anyway. A neat grid, numerals notched clean, the bend at 90 yards circled with a small square. He folded the paper as if it might otherwise shout. Baker's wire team ghosted through, packs low, antennae masked with tape. They moved across the deadly bend like men walking past a painting that used to make them sick, and now was only a frame on a wall. No one sped up. No one sauntered. The discipline held. Hold overwatch 2 minutes, Pike said. Then we peel. Ruiz blinked sweat out of the corner of his eye and let breath back into his chest. The lace stayed. The world stayed small. He watched the gully mouth where a third man would have gone if there had been one. There wasn't. Not today. At 0621, the patrol's hinge had swung. The trail that 8 squads had missed its meal. The enemy's arithmetic was broken for at least a morning. The rest of the turn, what happens when the scouts try to vanish through the dry gully in the satchel, tells a fuller story, lived. In the next few minutes, at 0624, the jungle exhaled. Nothing moved except the flies discovering their new geography. Ruiz stayed on his sight line, scanning the space between bodies and brush. The trail bent twice more before curling into a gully, the kind scouts used to fade into when they needed the earth to finish their sentence. Rizzo whispered, "You think there's more?" Ruiz didn't answer. He let his eyes unfocus just enough to catch movement by shape, not detail. That's when he saw it. A dark wedge at the gully mouth, too square for nature. "Satchel," he said. Pike's voice answered through the line. "Don't touch it yet." Tanaka crept forward on all fours, mud streaking his arms. He brushed the soil off the canvas. The bag wasn't explosive. It was paper heavy. Maps, range cards, a folded sheet of thin rice stalk covered in characters. Tan's breath caught. He knew what it was before he read it. A hand-drawn overlay, Japanese pencil marks noting coordinates with thin English words scrawled between them. Interrogation prep? They were tracking us, he murmured. Not ambushing and studying. The discovery shifted everything. The scouts weren't just harassing. They were cataloging. They had been mapping how Marines moved, breathed, reacted. Every radio cue, every patrol formation, every hesitation in terrain. All logged, refined, predicted. The satchel wasn't war spoil. It was a mirror. Pike crouched beside him. How many teams? 3, 2 recon pairs, 1 relay. This was the relay. They pulled signal data, meaning they knew our voice patterns. Tanaka looked up, sweat cutting a clean line down his cheek. They could have spoken as us next time. That thought went through the squad like a cold nail. A future ambush where orders came in perfect English but from the wrong hill. Pike nodded once. We burn it. We use what's left before we do. The satchel became the key. Tanaka copied the coordinates, blending them into his notebook. He realized the enemy's pre-sighted kill zones were nested in sequence, a circular pattern converging on this very ridge. They were funneling us here, he whispered. This was the final catch basin. Ruiz looked down at the bodies, the discipline in their stillness, and felt the uneasy truth. They had executed their mission to the letter, even in death. He could almost hear the logic of their commander. If we can't hold the island, let the terrain hold them for us. The jungle changed after that. Sound sharpened, light thinned. It was as if the island itself understood the hunt had shifted. The Americans weren't prey anymore. They were dismantling the traps. At 0630, a new sound emerged. Faint scraping above the gully. Ruiz swung his sight up. A third scout, alive, blood darkening one shoulder, dragging a mortar round with both hands. Too far for a pistol, too close for comfort. Movement, Rizzo hissed. Pike's hand sign flashed. Take him alive. Ruiz slid the M1 safety back, centered the front sight just left of the man's hip. The lace held tight. His breath settled. He aimed not to kill but to break motion, a mechanical calculation. The shot cracked. The man dropped without a scream, clutching his thigh. Rizzo was already running, rope in hand, covering the distance in 10 seconds flat. Tanaka followed, medical kit open before he even reached the man. The scout's face was shock more than pain. Young, maybe 20, eyes huge and a face streaked with mud and disbelief. His hand still clutched the round. Tanaka knelt, murmuring in Japanese. The soldier's eyes darted, then fixed on Tan's Nisei features, confusion overtaking fear. You, American, he rasped. Yes, Tan said softly, pressing a dressing to the wound. You speak English? The boy nodded once. Why study us? Tan asked. The answer came like an apology. War's already lost, but we can't go home empty. So we learn. Maybe they use it next time. Next time. The word hit Pike like recoil. He looked toward the horizon. Smoke over the sea where other wars waited to be born. They took the prisoner, wrapped the leg, and left the gully before the heat turned smell into memory. Pike set fire to the satchel at the next halt. Paper curled, edges blackened, letters became ash. Ruiz watched it burn and thought about the loop of cord on his rifle. How something so small could change aim, pulse, even fate. Maybe mercy was a kind of discipline too. The hardest kind. At 06:45, Baker Company reached the rim. The radio crackled with Rawls' voice, calm and distant. Good work, Baker. Line secure. You bought us the day. Pike looked at his men, mud, sweat and ash stitched into skin, and only said, Then let's make it worth something. The island, silent again, kept its own counsel. But for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel haunted. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the war had already moved on. Naval guns rumbled miles offshore, and the horizon flashed with carrier strikes against islands that had names no one in Baker Company would ever pronounce again. On Hachinawa, the jungle began reclaiming its dead before noon. Pike's men dug shallow graves for the enemy scouts. There were no flags, no speeches, just an understanding. Professionals burying professionals. Tanaka scrawled their names in his notebook as best he could decipher from insignia and tags, intending to hand them to the Red Cross later. The act felt both absurd and necessary, a fragile order imposed on chaos. Ruiz found himself kneeling over the youngest one, the boy with the mortar shell who had spoken English. His chest rose shallowly. He hadn't survived the climb. Ruiz stared at the still face, trying to imagine what kind of home had built that resolve, what kind of war made study of another man's heartbeat a duty. He wanted to feel anger. He couldn't. They carried the bodies to the clearing where the first patrol had vanished days earlier. For the Marines, it wasn't revenge. It was closure. They burned what they couldn't bury. Ammunition, satchel fragments, bloodied uniforms. The smoke drifted straight up through a break in the canopy, a single gray column visible all the way to the coast. For once, nobody called in the position. Everyone knew the island was finished with them. By dusk, supply jeeps clawed up the slope. The new radio operator brought sealed orders, redeployed to the southern coast for evacuation. The Black Island was being written off. Secured, the paperwork would say, though nothing about it felt secure. The men didn't cheer. They just started cleaning weapons in silence, methodical and slow. That night, the wind shifted from sea to land, carrying the scent of salt and gasoline from the beachhead. Ruiz sat by the edge of camp, his rifle across his knees, the bootlace looped loosely around his wrist. His hands didn't shake anymore. He flexed his fingers, realizing the tremor was gone, not because he'd conquered fear, but because fear had finally learned its place. Tanaka joined him, 2 tin cups in hand, filled with something that pretended to be coffee. They drank without speaking. After a while, Tan said, You know, in Japanese, Shizuka no Oko means quiet hill. Maybe that's what this place should be called. Ruiz nodded. It's earned it. Below them, faint lights flickered, engineers setting up demolition charges to flatten bunkers. They'd wire the island with explosives by morning, burn anything that might shelter another ghost patrol, but the ridge would stay. Rawls had ordered it left untouched. Memorial terrain, he'd said. Every company that lost men here would remember it that way. When the charges went off the next day, the sound rolled across the sea like a closing door. The hill didn't shake, it sighed. Then the echoes faded, and only the surf remained. Back aboard the transport ship, Pike wrote his final field report. Enemy resistance neutralized, recon pattern disrupted, 9 Ka, 4 wounded, objective achieved. He stopped before signing, hesitated, and added one more line. Recommend commendation for CPL Ruiz. Effective counter-sniper performance under fire. He didn't mention the bootlace. Some things were meant to stay between men who'd earned their own quiet. As the ship pulled away from Hachinawa, Ruiz stood at the rail watching the ridge sink into haze. The jungle was already closing over the scars. He wondered how long it would take before no one remembered what it cost to make the island still, The report from Captain Rawls' battalion never made headlines. There were no citations, no combat footage, no glowing articles in Stars and Stripes. Hachinawa wasn't the kind of battle the public ever heard about. It wasn't even a battle, really, just a piece of forgotten ground wrestled back from silence. But within the small world of Marine reconnaissance, the bootlace Sling story passed quietly from platoon to platoon. Not as myth, but as method. Young snipers tied cords around their rifles, copying what they'd heard Corporal Ruiz had done on the island that ate patrols. Gunnery sergeants who'd served under Pike carried the lesson into new units. Steadiness isn't a trick, it's a discipline. A few months later, Ruiz was back in training rotation at Pavuvu. The Pacific War was grinding toward its last brutal chapter, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, then maybe Japan itself. He taught marksmanship to replacements barely old enough to shave. Sometimes they asked him about Hachinawa, about the Ghost Scouts. He always gave the same answer. They were good, too good, but they blinked first. He never mentioned the satchel or the boy with the mortar round or how he'd felt the island breathe that morning. Those belonged to a part of the war no one could print on paper. Tanaka, reassigned to the interrogation detachment in Manila, translated captured documents for the coming invasions. Months later, he came across something that made him stop cold. A half-burned Japanese intelligence manual, recovered from a downed transport near Kyushu. Inside were sketches and notes copied almost exactly from the maps they had destroyed on Hachinawa. American radio procedures, patrol spacing, even a note about marksmen with corded slings. The information had spread anyway. Though too late to matter, Tan wrote a margin note before forwarding it up the chain. Knowledge travels faster than mercy, but only mercy endures. No one in headquarters commented. Yet the phrase lingered among translators long after the war. Pike retired in '46. He went home to Kansas, bought a small farm, and built his fences by hand. He never spoke publicly about Hachinawa, but in his study, pinned above his desk, hung a single photograph, not of battle but of a ridgeline under morning fog, taken from a reconnaissance camera. On the back, he'd written 2 words in neat block letters: "Hold steady." For Danny Ruiz, steadiness became a lifelong habit. He stayed in the Corps until Korea, carried the same Garand, same sling method. Once, during a post-action debrief near Incheon, a young lieutenant asked him why he tied his rifle that way. Ruiz smiled, gave the simplest answer he could: "Because your heart lies sometimes. The Corps doesn't." Years later, when his granddaughter asked him what war was like, he didn't talk about battles or medals. He told her about a hill that listened, and a moment when breathing slower saved his life. She grew up thinking of her grandfather as a quiet man who liked to fix things in the garage. Steady hands, patient voice. Only after his death did she find the faded bootlace in a small tin box, coiled like memory. In 1984, the Marine Corps Marksmanship Manual included a small training sidebar under improvised stability techniques. It cited an unnamed corporal from a 1944 Pacific engagement who had used a lace tension sling to counter pulse. Tremor in jungle conditions. Officially, it was just a footnote. Unofficially, it was Ruiz's signature and doctrine. And the island? It never appeared on any campaign ribbon. Hachinawa vanished back into Pacific anonymity, reclaimed by palms and coral, but the lesson survived in muscle and mind. That steadiness wasn't absence of fear, but mastery over it. That sometimes the smallest invention in the hands of one quiet Marine could tilt the rhythm of an entire war. Even if no one ever said his name aloud, the Pacific War ended the way all wars do, not with clarity but with exhaustion. Islands burned, oceans filled with wrecks, and men who had survived both began to wonder what survival was supposed to mean. Yet on ridges like Hachinawa, far from the headlines, something quieter had been learned. War had taught millions how to destroy. But a few men, like Pike, Tanaka, and Ruiz, had discovered how to hold still. That mattered more than anyone realized. Their small innovations and silent acts of discipline never appeared in war records, yet they shaped the conduct of soldiers who followed. Every Marine who steadied his breathing before a shot, every instructor who told recruits that calm was stronger than rage. They were echoing that forgotten ridge and the bootlace that had turned panic into precision. In hindsight, Hachinawa wasn't about tactics. It was about control, of the rifle, of the pulse, of the self. Decades later, when veterans met at reunions, they never bragged about how many enemies they'd killed. They talked about the moments they didn't, the times when steadiness, mercy, or restraint had saved more lives than aggression ever could. That, they came to realize, was the difference between surviving the war and carrying it home. Somewhere beneath the Pacific sky, the ridge still sleeps under vines and soil. The jungle has swallowed the trenches. The trees have rewritten the skyline. But if you stood there at dawn, you might still feel it. The hum of the island, listening to men who once learned how to make even fear go quiet. Because in the end, wars are remembered for who held their ground. But peace, real peace, belongs to those who learn to hold their breath. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.